Welcome, if you will, to Bedtime Lessons. I am Arthur Vance, and tonight we embark on a journey stretching back to a time so ancient that its echoes are but whispers in the vast archives of history. We speak of the world before the age of empires and before the grand narratives that often fill our history books. Indeed, before the very concept of a unified nation such as those we see today. Now, you might be wondering what exactly was happening on our planet 5,000 years ago. What did humanity look like, and how did they live? It's a fascinating question because much of what we consider modern civilization had yet to fully bloom. Imagine, if you will, a world where the vast majority of people lived in small, self-sufficient groups, perhaps hunting, gathering, or beginning to experiment with the earliest forms of agriculture. The warmth of the Holocene period, which had begun several millennia before, invited humanity to experiment, to settle. This period, after the last great ice age, offered a more stable climate, a canvas upon which early communities could begin to paint their future. It wasn't a sudden transformation, but a slow, gradual awakening, like the dawn creeping across a sleeping landscape. We often speak of civilization as a singular, shining achievement, but in truth, it was a mosaic of countless small innovations and adaptations, occurring in different places at different times. Think of the earliest agricultural practices, not vast fields tilled by machines, but perhaps a small patch of land, carefully tended, coaxing sustenance from the earth. What this meant is that humans began to stay in one place for longer periods. Their shelters grew more permanent, their tools more finely crafted. This shift from constant movement to settled life was truly monumental. It allowed for the accumulation of knowledge, for the development of traditions, and for the very first glimmers of what we might call culture in the broadest sense. Yet this was also a time of great fragmentation. There were no grand unified states, no vast kingdoms stretching across continents, merely countless individual communities, each with its own customs, its own stories, and its own way of understanding the world. The oldest documented evidence of writing, for instance, in places like Mesopotamia and the most ancient cities, suggest beginnings that predate many later well-known civilizations. It was a time of many separate sparks, each one a testament to human ingenuity and resilience. So, as we prepare to delve deeper into the intricate tapestries of these nascent societies, remember that we are looking at the very foundations. The bedrock upon which all future human complexity would eventually be built. It is a subtle shift, a quiet evolution, but one that would set the stage for everything that followed. World before time. Indeed, as we slowly drift from the unseen dawn into the faint whispers of civilization, we arrive at a particularly curious point in the grand tapestry of human understanding, the story we tell ourselves about our own beginnings. You see, for many years, a fascinating narrative has taken root in our collective consciousness, suggesting a monolithic 5,000 years of Chinese history. It's a comforting thought, isn't it? A lineage stretching back so far, so unbroken. Yet when we dust off the archives and examine the delicate fragments of the past, a more nuanced picture begins to emerge. Now here's what's interesting. While a rich and vibrant culture certainly existed, the earliest archaeological evidence and written records we possess for what we recognize as China truly coalesce around the Shang dynasty, a little over 3,600 years ago. Even if we generously include the more mythical Xia dynasty, a lineage often debated among scholars, we are still looking at a trajectory extending back roughly 4,000 years. Compare this, if you will, to the ancient lands of Mesopotamia, where cities like Uruk bloomed almost 7,000 years ago, or the enduring legacy of Egypt with its older systems of writing and monumental architecture. It suggests that perhaps the claim of a solitary 5,000-year continuous history is more a poetic flourish, or perhaps even a narrative employed for purposes beyond mere historical accuracy. What this means is that this narrative, while captivating, acts less as a precise historical measurement and more as a conceptual tool. It is often invoked to suggest a certain ancient wisdom, a unique patience, almost an entitlement to being treated differently on the global stage. We've seen this play out in the past, with arguments made for patience when it comes to democratic reforms or business dealings, especially with an eye turned towards the East. Remember, some might even suggest that because a civilization is perceived as older, it somehow merits a different standard of engagement, but history, you see, is not a competition measured solely by millennia. The true depth and wonder of any civilization lies not in the sheer length of its documented lineage, but in its intricate developments, its philosophies, its art, and its quiet resilience throughout the ages. And in this, the vast and ancient land we now call China offers a profound and beautiful story, one that truly needs no embellishment. First whispers of civilization. Indeed, as we slowly draw back the curtain on the distant past, we find ourselves peering into the origins of what we now call complex societies. You see, for much of human history, our ancestors lived in small nomadic bands, moving with the rhythms of the seasons and the migrations of animals. But at some point, something shifted. These smaller groups began to coalesce, to settle, and to grow, eventually forming the foundations of what we might recognize as cities. And with cities came a host of profound changes. What makes a society truly complex, you might ask? Well, it's more than just size. Think of it this way: a simple society is like a single thread, while a complex one is a tapestry woven from many different threads, each with its own purpose, yet all interconnected. Anthropologists often look for several key elements. We consider the emergence of towns and cities, not just collections of dwellings, but places with a distinct urban character. We look for a reliable surplus of food, meaning they produced more than they immediately consumed, allowing some people to engage in tasks beyond farming. This leads quite naturally to another hallmark: specialization. Instead of everyone being a farmer or a hunter, you begin to see craftspeople, priests, warriors, and administrators, each playing a distinct role in the societal structure. What's particularly interesting is how these roles often led to inequalities. Some individuals, by virtue of their position or skills, began to accumulate more wealth or power than others. And to manage all of this, the surplus, the specialists, the growing populations, and the emerging social hierarchies, you needed a more sophisticated form of governance. These early societies developed multifunctional political and economic systems, intricate webs of administration that managed resources, resolved disputes, and organized large-scale projects. Think of it as the gradual unfolding of an intricate clockwork mechanism, where each gear, once set in motion, influences all the others. The very bedrock of this transformation was often the shift towards agriculture. For millennia, humanity largely depended on hunting and gathering, a lifestyle that, while sustainable, rarely allowed for large, permanent settlements. But with a warming, more stable climate after the last ice age, a period we call the Holocene, beginning roughly 11,700 years ago, new opportunities arose. People began to experiment with cultivating plants and domesticating animals. It wasn't a sudden revolution, but rather a slow, patient process of discovery and adaptation. No single theory fully explains why our ancestors made this monumental shift. Some suggest it was a natural progression in fertile river valleys, where resources were abundant. Others propose that growing populations necessitated more intensive food production. Perhaps it was a combination of pressures, environmental changes, population increases, and even social desires for more elaborate rituals or prestige goods. Regardless of the precise spark, the consequences were profound. Agriculture encouraged a sedentary life, leading to permanent villages and denser populations. It gave rise to the need for more durable tools and sophisticated pottery for storing surpluses, and inadvertently, it also laid the groundwork for increased conflict. As valuable land and resources became something to protect or to take. Rivers of life. Our journey through the nascent stages of civilization now leads us to a fascinating, yet often misunderstood, concept: what truly defines a complex society. You see, as those early whispers of human ingenuity grew louder, and as our ancestors moved beyond the nomadic rhythms of hunter-gatherers, they began to weave ever more intricate tapestries of community life. And these complex societies are not just larger versions of what came before. They represent a fundamental shift in how people lived, organized themselves, and even thought about their place in the world. For a long time, the notion of civilization was perhaps overly simplistic, colored by the biases of those who studied it. Early scholars, steeped in their own cultural contexts, often imagined a straight, upward path from what they called savagery to barbarism and finally to civilization. But in the archives of history, with dust motes dancing in the twilight, we find that the story is far more nuanced than a simple linear progression. Today, we understand complexity not as a judgment of superiority, but rather as a description of how diverse parts of a society, its people, its crafts, its governance, become integrated into a larger, coherent system. Think of it like a grand, ancient clockwork mechanism, where countless cogs and springs, each with its own function, must work in harmony for the whole to keep time. So what are some of the hallmarks, the telltale signs of these emerging complex societies? While no single society possesses all of them perfectly, we might look for common threads. The emergence of cities, for instance, is often a powerful indicator. These are not just larger villages, but places where people live in dense proximity, requiring new forms of organization. With more mouths to feed, there is often a surplus of food, a product of intensified agriculture. This surplus, in turn, allows some individuals to specialize, to become master potters, skilled builders, or even dedicated administrators, rather than everyone simply working the land. This specialization inevitably leads to differences in status and wealth, creating varying degrees of social inequality. And of course, to manage all of this, multifunctional political and economic systems begin to take shape, moving beyond the simple communal structures of smaller groups. Now you might be wondering, what sets these profound changes in motion? What sparks this grand transformation from scattered groups to thriving, intricate societies? The story often begins with something deceptively simple: agriculture. After the last great ice age, as the climate warmed and stabilized, a window of opportunity opened. People began to experiment with cultivating plants and domesticating animals. It wasn't a sudden revolution, but a slow, gradual dance between humanity and nature, one that would, in time, reshape everything. It's a story, you see, of adaptation, ingenuity, and the relentless, quiet push of human endeavor. Each new seed planted, each animal brought under human care, was a tiny ripple in the vast river of human history, eventually flowing into the powerful currents that would carry us towards the world as we know it. Mesopotamia, cradle of cities. Our previous musings led us along the banks of ancient rivers, rivers that cradled the very first stirrings of human civilization. We saw how the simple act of cultivating the land, of coaxing sustenance from the earth, laid the bedrock for all that followed, and this, perchance, is where our quiet exploration takes a fascinating turn. You see, for a very long time, the story of human societies was told in a rather linear fashion. Early thinkers, much like those of us today, sought to understand how small, scattered groups of hunters and gatherers eventually coalesced into the grand, complex societies we call civilizations. Some, like the venerable Lewis Henry Morgan, imagined a ladder, a progression, moving from what he termed savagery to barbarism, and then, at last, to civilization. But this, my dear listeners, was a view colored by its own time and place, a certain ethnocentric lens, perhaps. Today, we approach these vast tapestries of time with a more nuanced understanding. We speak not of ladders, but of complexity, a term that encompasses both the rich diversity within a system and the intricate ways its many parts are woven together. Imagine a grand clockwork with countless gears and springs, each playing its small but vital role. The more gears, the more springs, the more finely tuned its movements, the more complex it becomes. This complexity, whether in a simple tool or a sprawling city, is a hallmark of sophisticated human organization. Now, what makes a society complex? Well, there are certain telltale signs, like whispers from the past, that guide our understanding. Consider the rise of cities, those bustling hubs where human ingenuity and ambition first truly took shape. Or the creation of a surplus of food, more than was immediately needed, which freed some to pursue crafts, artistry, or even the careful tending of spiritual life. The intensification of agriculture, moving beyond mere subsistence to deliberate, large-scale cultivation, is another key. And with this we find specialization, the potter focusing on clay, the weaver on cloth, the builder on stone. This division of labor, this quiet cooperation, is a foundational element. And alas, with it often comes inequality, as some roles become more valued, more powerful than others. Finally, the emergence of multifunctional political and economic systems, intricate webs of governance and trade, binds these disparate elements into a cohesive whole. Not every complex society will display each of these characteristics in equal measure, but it is the blend, the interplay of these forces that truly reveals their sophistication, what truly sparked this grand transformation. What nudge, what gentle persuasion, steered humanity from small, nomadic bands towards these intricate settlements? The answer, as is often the case with history, is rarely singular. It is a confluence of factors, a slow turning of the tide. The Holocene, that geological epoch we still inhabit, beginning some 11,000 years ago, brought with it a warmer, more stable climate. This gentle shift, this predictable rhythm of seasons, invited experimentation, encouraging our ancestors to look at a wild seed and wonder, could we make it grow? Could we perchance cultivate it rather than merely forage? The story of agriculture, of planting that first seed with intent, is the quiet prelude to all that we call civilization. Egypt's timeless sands. From the fertile crescent of Mesopotamia, where cities first whispered their names to the wind, we now turn our gaze eastward, to lands equally ancient, yet whose stories are often told with a different cadence. You see, when we speak of history, particularly ancient history, the narratives woven around certain civilizations can become quite robust, perhaps even a bit embellished over time. Take, for instance, the pervasive notion of 5,000 years of continuous history for China. It's a compelling idea, isn't it? A civilization stretching back into the deepest mists of time, unbroken and unchanging. Yet, if we were to meticulously sift through the archaeological dust and the earliest written scrolls, much like an archivist carefully examining aged documents, we might find a slightly different picture. The most venerable and well-documented evidence for China's earliest dynasties, such as the Shang, typically point to a beginning around 1600 years before the Common Era. Even incorporating the legendary Xia dynasty, which some scholars still ponder with a gentle skepticism, would only gently nudge that timeline back to perhaps 2000 BCE. It's a rich tapestry, most certainly, but perhaps not quite as ancient as some narratives would have us believe. Indeed, other ancient civilizations, those we've touched upon like Mesopotamia with its Uruk or the venerable lands of Egypt, often present us with older systems of writing and cities that blossomed even earlier. The very concept of a unified China as a singular, cohesive entity truly solidified around 221 BCE. This, perhaps interestingly, is a full century after the grand empire of Alexander the Great had come and gone, and several centuries before the Roman Empire reached its majestic zenith. What this means is that while China possesses a history both long and profoundly fascinating, the idea of its unique antiquity, particularly when compared to the cradles of civilization in the Near East or even the emerging cultures of Europe, requires a nuanced understanding. It's not about diminishing history, you see, but rather about accurately appreciating its whispers and echoes. Indus Valley Secrets. Our journey through antiquity now brings us to the East, to a land often spoken of with a reverence for its purported ancient origins, China. Many a casual conversation, or indeed even learned discourse, might begin with the assertion of 5,000 years of Chinese history. And while the tapestry of its past is undeniably rich and complex, we must, as diligent archivists of time, gently but firmly examine such sweeping claims. You see, when we look for the earliest verifiable threads of civilization in China, our archaeological and written records typically lead us to the Shang dynasty, which began its unfolding around 1600 BC. Even if we generously include the legendary, some might say mythical, Xia dynasty, we are looking at something closer to 2000 BC. This places its foundations, while certainly ancient, somewhat later than other cradles of civilization we have discussed. Consider, if you will, Mesopotamia, where cities like Uruk flourished some 7 millennia ago, or indeed the long history of Egypt with its much older systems of writing and urban development. The unification of China as a single imperial entity only truly occurred in 221 BC, a century after the vast empire forged by Alexander the Great, and several centuries before the Roman Empire reached its zenith. These are not small distinctions, and they temper the idea of a uniquely unparalleled antiquity when compared to, say, Europe. Now you might be wondering, why does this distinction matter so profoundly? Well, this narrative of an unbroken 5,000 years can at times be subtly woven into arguments suggesting that China requires a certain special treatment, perchance a prolonged patience for its democratic evolution, or a particular deference in business dealings. I recall, for instance, a curious statement from Mr. Eric Schmidt of Google back in 2007, justifying Google's concessions to censorship in China through this very lens of historical patience. He claimed it was a matter of respecting a culture that has traversed 5 millennia. Indeed, Google CN at that time actively censored search results concerning Tibet, Taiwan, or that poignant image of the tank man from Tiananmen Square. Ultimately, after cyberattacks targeting dissident accounts, Google chose to withdraw in 2009. Such examples illustrate the very real-world implications of these historical narratives. Then there's the pervasive idea of China as the longest continuous civilization. This presents China as a monolithic, unchanging entity. However, such a perspective can, I fear, skew our understanding of its past, present, and indeed its future. It may inadvertently reduce the Chinese people to passive figures destined to merely reenact the dramas of their own history. The truth, as it often is far more nuanced, more dynamic. Its history is a vibrant mosaic of change, of dynasties rising and falling, of cultural shifts and adaptations. It is a history that stands tall on its own merits without the need for embellishment, or for it to become merely a tool of nationalistic pride. Ancient China's beginnings. Our journey through the ancient world now brings us to a part of the globe often spoken of with a sense of immense antiquity, what we now refer to as China. Many believe its history stretches back 5 millennia, a narrative deeply woven into the modern understanding of this vast land. Yet, as with all stories from the mists of time, the threads often bear closer examination. Indeed, some documented evidence, both archaeological and written, for what would become China only truly coalesces around the Shang dynasty, which begins perchance around 1600 years before the Common Era. Even if we generously include the more mythical Xia dynasty, that would lead us back merely to about 2,000 years before Christ. This is not to diminish the grandeur of its unfolding narrative, but to place it, perhaps, in a slightly different light on the global stage. For when we cast our gaze further afield, across the landscape of our previous discussions, we find civilizations in Mesopotamia, in places like Uruk, with evidence of cities and written systems dating back almost 7,000 years. And ancient Egypt, too, harbored the sophisticated beginnings of writing far earlier. The unification of China as a single imperial entity arrived in 221 BCE, a full century after the empire forged by Alexander the Great, and several centuries before the Roman Empire reached its zenith. This places its political consolidation much later than some European traditions, challenging the notion of its unparalleled, unique antiquity. You see, this perceived notion of 5,000 years of history can, at times, become a curious tool. Some argue it is used to suggest a need for what is called special treatment for China, whether that be a demand for patience in awaiting democratic reforms or a certain deference in business dealings. One might recall Eric Schmidt of Google, for instance, once suggesting in 2007 that Google's concessions to censorship in China should be viewed through this lens of patience, given what he believed was its deeply ancient lineage. And so Google CN, for a time, filtered search results concerning Tibet or Taiwan or that singular image of the tank man from Tiananmen Square. Until cyberattacks on dissident accounts ultimately led Google to withdraw from that market in 2009. Similarly, Chris Patton, the last governor of Hong Kong, once recounted his advisors suggesting he remove any reference to two great and ancient civilizations from a speech, believing Chinese civilization to be far older than any European counterpart. His refusal perhaps spoke to a quiet understanding of historical nuance. A nation's long and fascinating history needs no such embellishment, no twisting of chronology. And indeed, to argue for an alleged superiority derived from a selectively interpreted long history, one might say, leads to a rather dangerous sense of entitlement. For if we were to apply such a logic universally, then perchance the descendants of Mesopotamia or ancient Egypt should lay claim to an even greater patience in business, or a more profound deferment of reforms. A curious proposition, wouldn't you agree? We must also guard against what I might term lazy writers who concoct false narratives of a glorious past for China, often to contrast it with newcomer Western cultures, as if to suggest one was inherently more sophisticated. Simon Winchester, for instance, once compared 2,000-year-old Chinese irrigation systems to Westerners who were still covering themselves with woad and little else than grunts. A vivid, if rather inaccurate, mental image, don't you think? Moreover, the very idea of China as the longest continuous civilization can be a monolithic one, painting a picture of an unchanging entity. This, I believe, distorts our perception of China in the past, in the present, and indeed in the future. Bestsellers such as Martin Jacques' When China Rules the World from 2009 often perpetuate this idea, presenting China as a unique civilizational state due to this perceived antiquity and continuity. These types of commentaries, in essence, risk reducing the Chinese people to passive victims of their own history, condemned, as it were, to merely repeat it, a notion I find rather unsettling. Instead, let us embrace the richness of every civilization's story, without the need for embellishment or comparison, as we turn our thoughts now to the echoes of early America. Early American echoes. Our journey through the earliest civilizations now brings us to a fascinating, yet often misunderstood, perspective on the very idea of ancient history itself. You see, when we speak of how old a civilization is, we are often tempted to accept certain narratives without careful examination. Indeed, you might commonly hear of 5,000 years of Chinese history, a resonant phrase certainly, and one that feels ancient and grand. However, as cautious historians, we must always turn to the dust-covered archives, the archaeological digs, and the earliest written records to truly understand the passage of time. And when we do, a slightly different picture begins to emerge. The most definitive evidence, the earliest documented proofs, both archaeological and textual, for what we recognize as foundational Chinese civilization, truly begin with the Shang dynasty, around 1600 years before the Common Era. Even if we generously include the more mythical Xia dynasty, which itself remains elusive in the archaeological record, we are looking at perhaps 2,000 years before the Common Era. Now, this is a venerable age, to be sure, but it is worth remembering how this compares to other cradles of civilization, like Mesopotamia, where cities such as Uruk stood nearly 7,000 years ago, or the ancient kingdom of Egypt with its elaborate hieroglyphics and structured society. Their systems of writing and urban centers existed long before the Shang. What's more, the concept of a truly unified China as a single empire, that particular thread in the grand tapestry of time, only truly begins around 221 BCE, well after the empires of Alexander the Great and centuries before the Roman Empire reached its own zenith. So, what does this mean for our understanding? It means that the narrative of a singular, uninterrupted 5 millennia span is perhaps more of a modern construct than a precise historical account. It is a story, perhaps, that emphasizes continuity over the ebbs and flows, the divisions and unifications that are the natural rhythm of all human history. And it is a story that, at times, can perhaps serve purposes beyond simply recounting the past. Nomads and settlers. Our journey through the echoes of early America has prepared us for a fascinating divergence, a sidestep, if you will, into the perhaps unexpected ways that history can be presented, or even at times gently reshaped. We often speak of ancient civilizations, Mesopotamia with its cities rising from the dust some 7 millennia ago, or Egypt with its enduring monuments and some of the oldest writing systems we know. These, by almost any measure, stand as venerable testaments to humanity's early ingenuity. Yet a particular narrative has taken root regarding another great civilization, China, claiming a continuous history stretching back 5,000 years. This notion, while deeply ingrained in popular imagination and sometimes in official rhetoric, merits a closer, quieter examination. Indeed, when we look towards the earliest documented archaeological and written evidence for what we now understand as China, our reliable records primarily begin with the Shang dynasty. Around 1600 BCE, if one were to extend this to include the mythical Xia dynasty, which itself hovers at the edge of legend, we might reach back to perhaps 2000 BCE. Now this is an immense span of time, a rich and complex tapestry of human endeavor, development, and change, but it does not quite align with the grand pronouncement of 5 millennia. You see, the unification of various disparate states into a singular, cohesive China as an empire occurred much later, in 221 BCE. To put that into perspective, this happened a full century after the vast empire forged by Alexander the Great had emerged and then dissolved, and several centuries before the Roman Empire reached its own zenith. So when we compare, quite dispassionately, the chronological benchmarks, other civilizations do appear to possess older, more firmly established timelines for their foundational cities and their script. This discrepancy, this gentle stretching of historical time, is important because it often carries a subtle yet profound implication in our contemporary world. It sometimes underpins an argument for China's special treatment, as if its sheer antiquity demands a different kind of patience. Well, perhaps in waiting for democratic reforms, or a particular approach in business relations. Imagine, if you will, the former Google executive Eric Schmidt in 2007, suggesting that Google's concessions to censorship in China were born from a need for patience due to this perceived long history. He was referencing the very challenges Google CN faced, censoring search results for sensitive topics such as Tibet, Taiwan, or the poignant image of the tank man from Tiananmen Square. This path, as we know, eventually led to Google's withdrawal from the Chinese market in 2009 after cyber attacks on dissident accounts. Or consider Chris Patten, the last British governor of Hong Kong, whose advisors once suggested removing a reference to two great and ancient civilizations from a speech, believing Chinese civilization was somehow vastly older. He wisely chose to disregard this advice. Now, to be clear, the actual verifiable history of China is undeniably long and filled with a profound richness that requires no embellishment. It is a story of ingenuity, philosophy, artistic brilliance, and societal evolution. What becomes problematic, what merits our quiet contemplation, is when this history is, perchance, manipulated, when it becomes less about understanding the past and more about serving a narrative of nationalism or a sense of inherent superiority. This can lead to a rather dangerous sense of entitlement, you see, if we were to apply this very same logic to, say, ancient Mesopotamia or Egypt. It would imply a similar, perhaps illogical, demand for patience in modern business dealings or reform efforts concerning those regions. It simply doesn't hold up. This narrative, this stretching of time, also encourages what might be called lazy writing in some quarters, creating a seemingly self-evident, glorious Chinese past that is then conveniently contrasted with the newcomer cultures of the West. Simon Winchester, for instance, once rather colorfully compared 2,000-year-old Chinese irrigation systems to Westerners who were still covering themselves with indigo and grunting little more. Such comparisons, while vivid, often obscure more than they reveal. And herein lies the true heart of the matter. This persistent myth of China as the longest continuous civilization creates a monolithic, unchanging entity in our minds. It distorts our perception of China, in its past, its present, and indeed its future. When authors such as Martin Jacques in his 2009 bestseller, Rise of Kingdoms. Now, as we deepen our exploration into the earliest stirrings of human civilization, it's worth pausing to consider how we define these complex societies and the grand narratives we sometimes construct around them. For millennia, humanity dwelled in smaller, more intimate groups, hunters and gatherers intimately connected to the land. But then something shifted. A warming climate, new possibilities, and the slow, deliberate dawn of agriculture began to reshape everything. You see, the transition from these smaller bands to larger, more intricate communities was not a sudden burst, but a gradual unfolding, a long, sweeping symphony conducted by countless small choices and adaptations. Scholars have often grappled with defining what makes a complex society or a true civilization, and in their earnest attempts they sometimes found themselves ensnared in older, perhaps less objective frameworks. Early thinkers, for instance, envisioned a single upward path of progress, placing their own societies at the apex, a rather charming, if somewhat provincial view, wouldn't you say? Today, we look instead to the concept of complexity itself. It's not about judging a society, but rather understanding its intricate tapestry, how many diverse threads are woven into it, and how tightly those threads are integrated. Think of it as a spectrum, not a rigid checklist. A society might manifest monumental architecture, or perhaps a system for irrigating vast fields, a surplus of food that allows some to specialize in crafts or governance, clear evidence of inequality, or perhaps a multifaceted political system. What truly matters is the interplay of these elements, how they combine and diverge across the broad sweep of human history. And at the very heart of this transformation, this grand shift toward complexity, lies agriculture. It allowed for settled life, for the cultivation of specific plants and the domestication of animals. You might imagine that once humanity discovered farming, all else simply followed. However, the exact why of agriculture's emergence is still a gentle whisper in the winds of archaeological debate. Was it born from necessity, from populations outgrowing their wild resources, or from opportunity, as a more stable climate presented new possibilities? Perhaps it was a social endeavor, driven by the desire for communal feasts or the prestige of providing for more. Indeed, it was likely a mosaic of these reasons, each playing its part in different corners of the ancient world. But once farming took root, its tendrils spread far and wide, influencing everything. Settled life led to more permanent dwellings, to tools designed for cultivation rather than constant movement. And with more people living in closer proximity and with more resources to potentially defend, the shadow of conflict, of warfare, began to lengthen across the land. What this meant, however, was also a deepening of interdependence, a greater need for organization and cooperation, the slow, steady forging of larger social structures, preparing the ground, as it were, for the flourishing of something even more intricate, the phenomenon we call the state. Priests and power. Consider for a moment the very idea of a complex society. When we speak of civilizations, of kingdoms rising and falling, what precisely do we mean by complex? It's a term often used, but perhaps not always fully understood. You see, early thinkers, in their earnest attempts to categorize humanity, sometimes fell into the trap of linear progression, imagining societies simply climbing a ladder from primitive to advanced. Yet the truth, as always, is far more nuanced, isn't it? What truly defines this state of complexity is not merely size, but rather a dance between diversity and integration. Imagine a grand tapestry, woven with many threads of different colors and textures, all coming together to form a coherent, intricate pattern. That, in essence, is a complex society. It possesses cities, yes, with their bustling markets and monumental structures, but it also has something more profound, a reliable surplus of food, supporting a population beyond just those who toil in the fields. This surplus, in turn, allows for specialization, where some individuals can dedicate their lives to craft or governance, or indeed to study. Such societies often display greater inequality, it is true, for with specialization comes hierarchy, and they are marked by multifunctional political and economic systems, intricate webs of governance and trade that bind these diverse threads together. Not every complex society will manifest every single one of these traits, of course, but the more they possess and the more deeply integrated these traits become, the more intricate that societal tapestry truly is. Now, how did this all begin, this remarkable shift from small, nomadic bands to these vast, interconnected systems? Much of it, as one might suspect, traces back to the soil, to the slow, patient emergence of agriculture. For countless millennia, humanity hunted and gathered, living at the mercy of nature's bounty. But as the climate warmed and stabilized after the last great ice age, some simply began to experiment. Perhaps it was the observation of scattered seeds growing in fertile ground, or the careful tending of wild grains. Many theories have been proposed, from the lure of oases to the pressure of growing populations, or even the allure of feasting, where an abundance of food might enhance social standing. No single explanation captures all the varied paths taken by humanity, but what is clear is that agriculture, once adopted, began to transform everything. It tethered people to the land, fostering a settled way of life. It allowed for the accumulation of durable artifacts, for the building of more permanent shelters. And with the gathering of people and the accumulation of resources came changes in social structure, in conflict, and in our relationship with the very earth beneath our feet. The seeds once sown truly began to sprout into something quite extraordinary. First written word. As we journeyed through the intricate relationship between priests and power, we saw how spiritual authority often intertwined with worldly dominion, shaping the very fabric of ancient societies. It was a delicate dance, oft full of subtle negotiations and overt declarations of divine right, yet the foundations upon which these complex societies were built were not merely spiritual or political. They were also deeply rooted in how humans began to organize themselves, their resources, and their knowledge. You see, the evolution of human groups, from humble gatherings of hunter-gatherers to the sprawling, intricate tapestry of what we now call civilizations, is a story of increasing complexity. Indeed, what exactly do we mean by a complex society or a civilization? For decades, scholars wrestled with these definitions, sometimes falling into the trap of ethnocentric views, believing their own cultures inherently superior or more evolved. But we must resist such simple narratives, mustn't we? Instead, let us consider complexity as a measure of both the diversity within a system and the intricate ways its many parts are integrated. Imagine a simple machine versus a grand, elaborate clockwork mechanism. Both perform a function, but one possesses a far richer array of interconnected gears and levers. Now, here's what's interesting. When archaeologists and anthropologists observe these complex societies, they often find certain correlations. Patterns that seem to emerge again and again. Think of cities, those bustling hubs where many people live in close proximity, or the deliberate creation of surplus food, growing more than is immediately needed. This often required intensifying agriculture, coaxing more from the land through clever techniques, and with surplus comes specialization where not everyone must toil in the fields. Some can become potters or weavers or indeed priests. Inequality, sadly, often follows suit as some individuals or groups accrue more wealth or status. And finally, we see the rise of multifunctional political and economic systems, structures that manage and govern these increasingly diverse and integrated populations. Not every complex society shows every single one of these traits, of course, but the presence, and indeed the quality of these elements gives us a lens through which to understand just how intricate a society truly was. It's like looking at an ancient mosaic, noticing not just the individual pieces, but how they all fit together to form a grander design. This is important because these features didn't simply appear overnight like magic. They evolved, slowly, painstakingly over centuries, and at the heart of this dramatic shift was often agriculture. The ability to cultivate the land and domesticate animals was a profound step. It allowed for a more settled way of life, a stable food supply, and ultimately, the population growth that fueled the very emergence of these early complex worlds. Crafting ancient worlds. From the very beginning, we've walked through the silent archives of time, examining how human societies gradually became more intricate, more complex. We've observed the whispers of early settlements, the quiet shift from wandering to rooted life, and the profound blossoming of those first written words, the very keys to unlocking the past. Now, as these communities grew, as their knowledge deepened, and as their populations expanded, a new kind of necessity emerged, a need to connect beyond their immediate horizons. You see, no single village, no matter how clever or industrious, possessed all the resources it might need. Some had an abundance of good timber, others a rich vein of obsidian for tools, and still others, perhaps, fertile lands yielding bountiful harvests. And so, quite naturally, a rudimentary form of exchange began, a bartering of goods here, a swapping of skills there. It was a humble beginning, to be sure, but it laid the groundwork for something far more expansive, the vast, intricate network of trade routes. Imagine, if you will, the early pathways, perhaps just a worn track through a forest or a faint trail winding along a riverbank. These were not grand highways or paved roads, but rather threads of connection, spun by the quiet determination of early traders. They carried their burdens, perhaps a basket of rare shells, or a bundle of finely crafted arrowheads, often over long and arduous distances, driven by the simple promise of acquiring something new, something unavailable in their own immediate world. This wasn't merely about basic subsistence anymore. It was about enrichment, about variety, and in its own subtle way, about progress. These early trade routes, though often fragile and susceptible to the whims of nature or the sudden threat of rival groups, fostered an incredible exchange. It wasn't just physical goods that moved along these paths, you see. Ideas traveled too, technologies, even beliefs and customs. A distinctive pottery style from one region might inspire a craftsman 100 miles away. A more efficient way of cultivating a crop, perhaps observed during a brief stop at a foreign settlement, might be adopted and adapted back home. It was a slow, organic spread, like ripples moving across a still pond, each interaction carrying a fragment of one culture to another. What's particularly fascinating is how these routes often followed the natural contours of the land. Rivers became arteries of commerce, carrying canoes laden with goods. Mountain passes, though treacherous, became strategic gateways connecting disparate valleys. The very geography of the ancient world began to dictate the flow of exchange, shaping the patterns of human interaction as profoundly as any decree from a king. These were the true foundations of early globalization, laid not by emperors or armies, but by the quiet, persistent footsteps of traders. Trade routes emerge. Our journey through the nascent stages of civilization has brought us to a fascinating juncture, the very structure of a complex society itself. As we trace the subtle threads woven into the tapestry of human history, it becomes clear that defining complexity is not as straightforward as one might initially believe. For decades, our understanding was often blurred by perspectives that favored one culture over another. But today, we strive for a more objective lens. Think of complexity not just as grand cities or towering monuments, but as the intricate dance between many different parts within a single system. It's about diversity, yes, but also about how those diverse elements come together, integrate, and rely upon one another. Imagine a finely tuned clock where each gear, spring, and lever performs its own unique function, yet all work in concert to mark the passage of time. That cooperative arrangement, that's complexity. Now, how might we recognize such a society? Well, certain patterns tend to emerge. We often see the rise of cities, those bustling centers of human activity that draw people together. A society becomes more sophisticated when it can reliably produce more food than its people immediately need, a surplus allowing some to pursue endeavors beyond mere sustenance. This often goes hand in hand with agricultural intensification, coaxing more from the land through ingenious methods, and with these changes, specialization begins to flourish. Some become potters, others weavers, still others scribes or priests. Not everyone needs to farm. This in turn can lead to a shift in social structures, creating what we call inequality, some individuals or groups holding more influence or resources than others. And to manage all of this, multifunctional political and economic systems typically arise, structures that govern and organize the intricate relationships within the community. Not every complex society will display all these characteristics, mind you, but the more of them we observe and the more deeply they are intertwined, the greater our sense of that society's intricate nature. Indeed, the very bedrock of many of these early complex societies was agriculture. The shift from a nomadic existence to tending to the land, it was a profound transformation. You see, the warmer, more stable climate that emerged after the last great ice age, some 11,700 years ago, provided the perfect canvas for humanity to experiment with cultivating plants. For a long while, scholars have pondered the precise triggers for this revolution. Was it a retreat to oases during dry periods, as some once suggested, or perhaps a gradual unfolding in naturally abundant habitats? Others have wondered if it was the pressure of a growing population that necessitated finding new ways to feed everyone. Or even a subtle push from the fringes of fertile lands where resources were just scarce enough to encourage innovation. Then there are the more subtle social theories, suggesting that perhaps the desire for prestige, through hosting feasts and accumulating goods, fueled the need for greater food production. No single idea seems to explain every instance, but each offers a glimpse into a piece of this grand puzzle. What we do know is that once embraced, agriculture profoundly reshaped human existence. It encouraged people to settle in one place, leading to more lasting homes and a richer material culture. And while it promised stability, it also, perhaps ironically, led to greater instances of conflict and warfare as communities now had more to protect and more to covet. This intensified way of life, in turn, often pushed the boundaries of agricultural practices even further, a continuous cycle of change and adaptation. Early laws and order. Now, as we cast our gaze across the ancient world, we might notice a curious tendency to view certain civilizations as uniquely antique, exceptionally long-lived. This perception perhaps is most often applied to China, with whispers of 5 millennia of unbroken history. But here, my friends, in the hushed corners of historical archives, we find that the grand tapestries are sometimes rewoven over time, threads added, or perhaps subtly altered. Indeed, when we delve into the earliest verifiable records, the archaeological finds, the written pronouncements for China, we primarily trace them back to the Shang dynasty. This period, roughly commencing around 1600 BCE, provides us with the first solid ground beneath our feet. Even if we generously embrace the mythical Xia dynasty, which predates the Shang, our timeline only stretches back to perhaps 2000 BCE. This, you see, is a grand and venerable history, certainly, but it reminds us that other cradle civilizations of our world exhibit even older verifiable systems of writing and urban centers. Think of Mesopotamia, particularly the ancient city of Uruk, where organized life flourished some 7,000 years ago. Or consider the enduring legacy of ancient Egypt, with its hieroglyphs and monumental structures reaching back into equally distant mists of time. The idea of a uniquely ancient and continuously unified China also merits a closer look, for a truly unified China as a cohesive empire emerges much later in the chronicle of human civilization. The Qin dynasty in 221 BCE marks this significant consolidation. This perhaps is a little over a century after the vast empire forged by Alexander the Great in the Hellenistic world, and several centuries before the Roman Empire reached its zenith. What this tells us, perhaps, is that the narrative of exceptional antiquity and unbroken continuity, while comforting, doesn't quite align with the nuanced ebb and flow of historical evidence. Sometimes such grand historical narratives are presented and perhaps utilized in ways that transcend mere historical accuracy. You might be wondering, why does this matter? Well, consider how these narratives can shape contemporary perceptions. There's a subtle yet powerful suggestion that such a profound and ancient ancestry necessitates a certain special treatment for a nation, perhaps a measure of undue patience for reforms, or a different set of expectations in the arena of global business. It's almost as if the very length of a history bestows a unique form of gravitas that demands deferential understanding. We've seen instances where corporations, such as Google in its earlier foray into the Chinese market, made concessions to censorship, with the justification of needing patience due to China's long history. This led to uncomfortable chapters where certain search results relating to Tibet to Taiwan or to the poignant tank man image from Tiananmen Square were notably absent. The eventual withdrawal of Google from that market in 2009, following cyberattacks, highlights the complexities that arise when history is used not merely to inform, but to persuade and to shape policy. Even esteemed figures such as Chris Patten, the last governor of Hong Kong, recall being advised to remove references to other ancient civilizations from his speeches, lest China's own age be diminished in comparison. The feeling, you see, was that China's history was somehow greater, more profound, and therefore required a singular acknowledgement. Now, this isn't to diminish China's truly long and utterly fascinating past, its rich cultural legacy, its innovations, its philosophical traditions. These stand on their own merit without needing any embellishment or spinning of historical timelines. But the insistence on a 5,000-year history, or the notion of the longest continuous civilization can, at times, become a tool of nationalism, a justification for a perceived sense of entitlement. It risks reducing the diverse experiences of the Chinese people throughout millennia into a singular, monolithic, unchanging entity. This can distort our understanding, not only of China's past, but also of its present and even its future trajectory. Building the wonders. Our journey through the earliest civilizations often brings us to a fascinating question. How do societies grow from small, scattered groups into the grand, complex structures we call civilizations? This isn't a simple question, you see, and throughout history, many have pondered its answer, from ancient philosophers to modern anthropologists. It's a tale of slow, incremental changes, often invisible to those living within them, that eventually transform the very fabric of human existence. Now, when we speak of complexity, we aren't suggesting one society is inherently better than another. Rather, it's about how many different parts there are in its structure, and how intricately those parts are woven together. Imagine a simple woven basket versus a vast, complex tapestry. Both are creations, but one has many more threads, many more colors, and many more layers of design. Early theories, perhaps a little too eager to categorize, sometimes suggested a straightforward, step-by-step evolution, almost as if all societies were destined to follow the same path. But the truth, as it so often is far more nuanced, like the gentle meandering of a river rather than a straight canal. Indeed, the rise of complex societies often correlates with a handful of key factors. Think of the emergence of true cities, bustling hubs far grander than mere villages, or the production of surplus food, more than just enough to survive but enough to store, to trade, and to support those who didn't work the fields. This led to a specialization of labor, where some became artisans, others priests, and still others leaders. This, perchance, birthed a degree of social inequality, as roles and resources became unevenly distributed. And with these changes, we observe the emergence of multifaceted political and economic systems, far grander than the simple governance of a familial group. Not every civilization exhibits every single one of these traits, you see, but a good many begin to intertwine them. What truly laid the groundwork for this monumental shift was agriculture. The story begins in the Holocene period after the last great ice age, when the climate became warmer and more stable. This stability, like a calm lake, allowed early peoples to experiment with cultivating plants and domesticating animals. Various theories have been proposed to explain this transition. Some suggest it was born of desperate need, others from an abundance of resources. Perhaps it was a combination, like many small streams feeding into a larger river. What is certain is that agriculture fundamentally reshaped human life, encouraging a settled existence, leading to more permanent artifacts and monumental architecture, and often, sadly, to increased conflict over those precious resources. It's an unfolding story of humanity gradually shaping the world around it, and in turn being shaped by its own innovations. Forgotten technologies. Having explored the magnificent structures and the sheer ingenuity of ancient builders, we now turn our gaze to the lives lived within the shadows of these wonders. For even as grand temples rose to the heavens and sprawling cities took shape, it was the everyday rhythm of human existence that truly defined these nascent civilizations. Imagine, if you will, the hum of activity in a bustling Mesopotamian city, a symphony of sounds as distinct from our modern world as the stars are from the sun. Now, when we speak of early civilizations, we often think of a rapid ascent from simple hunter-gatherer bands to complex societies with intricate social structures. You see, the warmer and more stable climate that emerged after the last ice age, some 11,000 years ago, presented a unique tapestry of opportunities for humankind. It was in this fertile twilight that experimentation with the cultivation of plants truly began, a quiet revolution that would forever alter the course of human history. This shift from merely gathering what nature provided to actively shaping its bounty was not a sudden revelation, but rather a gradual unfolding, a slow dance with the earth, if you will. Historians and archaeologists have long pondered the precise impetus for this profound change. Was it perhaps a desperate response to dwindling resources, as some theories suggest, or perhaps a fortunate discovery, almost by chance, in a particularly abundant natural habitat? There are those who believe that increasing populations necessitated a more intensive way to produce food, pushing communities to cultivate deliberately. And others still argue for a social aspect, that the desire for feasting, for prestige, for the strengthening of communal bonds, provided the spark for agriculture. What's clear is that no single explanation captures the full essence of this pivotal moment, but rather elements of truth can be found woven through each of these perspectives. It was a complex interplay, like threads in an ancient fabric, each contributing to the evolving pattern. This embrace of agriculture brought with it a cascade of transformations. Settlements, once temporary encampments, grew into permanent villages. Homes, once quickly constructed, became more sturdy, designed to endure. And with this newfound sedentism, the material culture of these early peoples began to flourish. Picture the creation of durable pottery, vessels for storing grains and liquids, tools honed for the tilling of soil, and eventually even the earliest forms of monumental architecture, though perhaps not on the colossal scale we discussed earlier. Yet this stability also brought challenges. Larger, more permanent settlements and the accumulation of resources often led to increased competition, sometimes escalating into conflict and even warfare. This in turn spurred a greater need for organization, for defense, and for leadership, laying the groundwork perchance for the very first seeds of governance and statehood. The quiet act of planting a seed, it seems, held within it the blueprint for civilization itself. Daily life unveiled. Last time we touched upon forgotten technologies, and now we turn our gaze to something even more ephemeral, more deeply ingrained in the human experience, our beliefs. For what are we if not the sum of our stories and our understanding of the world around us? What truly endures are the whispers of ancient faiths and philosophies. Indeed, when we speak of what truly lasts across the vast stretches of time, it is not merely the bricks and mortar or the cleverly crafted tools, but the narratives we build to make sense of our existence. These narratives, these beliefs, are the very foundation upon which societies are formed, wars are waged, and art is born. Think of it this way: every civilization, every group of people has looked up at the same stars and wondered. The answers they found, the stories they told themselves, shaped everything that came after. We often hear tales of ancient civilizations, grand narratives about their long histories. You might have encountered the notion, for instance, of a 5,000-year history for certain cultures. This idea, while poetic, sometimes serves a different purpose than merely relaying facts. It can be a powerful tool, you see, a way to weave a certain narrative about continuity, about a unique and unyielding past. But if we are to truly understand the beliefs of the ancients, we must also gaze with a clear eye upon the stories we tell about them, and ourselves. Now here's an interesting thought. When we dig into the earliest verifiable records, the archaeological whispers and the first written words, for some of these famously ancient cultures, we find the timelines often begin a little later than popularly imagined. For instance, in what we now call China, the earliest documented evidence, both archaeological and in writing, often points to the Shang dynasty, around 1600 BCE. Even if we venture further back into the mists of myth, to the fabled Xia dynasty, we are still speaking of something closer to, perhaps, 2000 BCE. This is a profound history, certainly rich and deep, but perhaps not quite the sprawling 5 millennia that is sometimes claimed. What this means is not to diminish the profound and beautiful tapestry of human endeavor in that region, not at all, but rather to understand how narratives of great antiquity are sometimes constructed. Consider other ancient civilizations, Mesopotamia, for example, with cities like Uruk flourishing some 7,000 years ago, boasting some of the world's oldest writing systems. Or ancient Egypt, whose monuments and hieroglyphs stretch far back into the twilight of human memory. You see, the comparison reveals not a shorter history in one place, but a richer, more nuanced understanding across many. It highlights how different peoples, across different lands, independently reached similar pinnacles of societal organization and expression, albeit at different moments in the grand, meandering river of time. This distinction, this gentle reevaluation of historical claims, is important. Sometimes the idea of an unbroken, uniquely ancient civilization is used to suggest a certain exceptionalism, a need for special treatment perhaps, or a patience that might not otherwise be warranted. It's a subtle form of persuasion, a gentle nudge toward a particular viewpoint that hinges upon the perceived immense age and continuity of a culture. But the truth is, the beauty of ancient beliefs, the profound wisdom that echoes through the ages, does not require a stretching of the historical record. It simply asks us to listen. Beliefs of the ancients. Our previous discussion gently illuminated the intricate daily lives of those who walked this earth 5 millennia ago. We touched upon the nascent flicker of early societies, the first glimmers of settled existence. What becomes clear as we pore over the archaeological remnants and the faint echo of vanished voices is that these early communities, though seemingly simple to our modern gaze, were often remarkably sophisticated, particularly in their organization of labor, in their ways of feeding a growing population. They began to navigate the delicate dance between human ingenuity and the whims of nature. Now, as we deepen our understanding of these complex societies, we must consider how they emerged from the smaller nomadic groups of hunters and gatherers. This journey from simplicity to complexity is not a straight path, you see, but a winding river touched by countless tributaries. We speak of complexity not merely as better, but as a state of greater diversity and integration, where many different parts work together within a system. Think of a grand tapestry, richly woven with many threads, each serving its own purpose, yet all contributing to the whole. Indeed, when we look at the hallmarks of what we might call a complex society, certain patterns begin to emerge. We often find the rise of cities, those bustling hubs where people gathered in numbers previously unimaginable. With these cities came the need for food beyond immediate consumption, a surplus carefully stored, which allowed some to specialize in crafts or governance rather than solely in cultivation. This intensification of agriculture was crucial, demanding more organized efforts, perhaps even early forms of irrigation, to coax more from the land. Specialization then followed naturally. Instead of every person performing every task, some became potters, others weavers, still others, perhaps, administrators or priests. This division of labor, in turn, often led to a certain degree of inequality within the society itself, not always in a malicious sense, but simply in the differing roles and responsibilities these specialized endeavors created. And underpinning all of this, multifunctional political and economic systems began to take hold. Imagine, if you will, the early attempts at systems of governance, of trade, of law, all seeking to orchestrate this intricate dance of diverse parts. It's important to remember, however, that not every complex society displayed every single one of these traits perfectly. Rather, it is the overall quantity and quality of these elements, their presence and particular arrangement, that helps us gauge the true depth of a society's complexity. There isn't a simple checklist, you see, but more of a nuanced appreciation for the sophisticated interplay of life's many facets within these nascent civilizations. And this journey from the scattered hunter-gatherer to the settled urban dweller, this was often catalyzed by a profound shift in how humanity engaged with the very earth beneath its feet. Clash of cultures. Indeed, when we contemplate the vast stretches of human history, it becomes clear that the rise and fall of great civilizations are seldom, if ever, attributable to a single cause. The story of their unraveling, if you will, is often a complex tapestry woven from many threads: internal strife, environmental pressures, shifting power dynamics, and sometimes events beyond human control. It is a nuanced understanding that challenges simplistic explanations, for the echoes of the past tell us that the very foundations of what seems eternal can, with time, begin to shift and crumble. Take the captivating narrative of the classic Maya, for instance. For centuries, their cities flourished, their mathematical and astronomical knowledge reached astounding heights, and their artistry adorned towering temples in the Mesoamerican jungles. Yet around 900 AD, many of these once vibrant centers began to be abandoned. The urban landscapes that had teemed with life fell silent, slowly reclaimed by the encroaching forest. This profound transformation isn't a story of a people vanishing entirely, but rather of a complex societal system undergoing a dramatic collapse. You see, the causes for this decline were multifaceted. Imagine, if you will, a delicate ecosystem. If one part is overly stressed, how long can the others remain unaffected? The Maya faced immense demographic pressure as their populations grew, putting ever-increasing demands on their agricultural systems. This led to the exhaustion of resources as forests were cleared for farming and the delicate balance of the land was disturbed. Environmental changes also played a crucial, perhaps even devastating, role. Evidence suggests a series of prolonged and severe droughts afflicted the region during this period. What was already a challenging existence became untenable for many. Farmers, accustomed to predictable rainfall, found their crops failing, leading to food shortages and widespread hardship. This is where the interconnectedness of a complex society truly reveals itself. A decline in food production invariably leads to social unrest, as the very sustenance of life becomes precarious. Then there were the internal political struggles. The Maya were not a unified empire, but rather a collection of city-states, each with its own divine king or Ajo. Beneath the veneer of shared culture and ritual, these polities were often in fierce competition, vying for prestige, territory, and captives. As resources dwindled and populations suffered, this rivalry often escalated into endemic warfare. One can visualize the region of Pedixbatan, for example, where the once proud cities of Dus Pilas and Aguetka eventually fell as a result of these relentless conflicts. Kings, once seen as sacred intermediaries with the gods, may have lost legitimacy as their rituals failed to bring rain or prosperity. So it wasn't a single catastrophic event, but rather a confluence of these pressures. Environmental stress, overpopulation, resource depletion, and relentless warfare created a perfect storm, pushing the classic Maya societal structure beyond its breaking point. However, it is vital to remember this. It was the complex society that collapsed, not the people themselves. The Maya did not disappear, they adapted. They migrated, they reorganized, and they forged new ways of living, giving rise to post-classic societies. Indeed, their descendants live on today, vibrant and resilient, in places like Guatemala and Mexico. Their enduring presence is a testament to the remarkable adaptability of humanity, even in the face of profound change. A lesson that echoes across the millennia, reminding us that even in collapse, there is often transformation. Disappearing civilizations. The echoes of ancient civilizations, stretching back through millennia, often whisper tales of origin and continuity. You see, there's a widely held belief, a popular notion perhaps, that China's history spans an uninterrupted 5,000 years. This idea of a singular, enduring identity, a continuous thread weaving through ages. It's a compelling narrative, isn't it? But as we delve into the dust and decipher the faint inscriptions of the past, we begin to uncover a more nuanced story. Indeed, if we look to the earliest documented archaeological and written evidence, the tangible proofs that historians rely upon, China's documented past reaches back to the Shang dynasty, around 1600 BCE. Even if we were to embrace the accounts of the mythical Xia dynasty, often spoken of in hushed tones of legend, that would only extend the timeline to approximately 2000 BCE. This is still a vast expanse of time, certainly a rich tapestry of human endeavor. However, it's a different span than the 5 millennia often cited. Now here's what's interesting. Other cradles of civilization offer even earlier glimpses into organized human life. Consider Mesopotamia, with its ancient city of Uruk flourishing some 7,000 years ago, or the enduring legacy of Egypt, with its hieroglyphs and monumental architecture. These societies developed intricate writing systems and established bustling cities long before China's documented dynasties. What this means, of course, is not a diminishment of China's profound historical importance, but rather an invitation to view history through a more precise lens. Think of it this way, the unification of China into a single empire only occurred in 221 BCE. To put that into perspective, this happened a full century after Alexander the Great had carved out his mighty empire, and several centuries before the Roman Empire reached its zenith. This timeline suggests that while China possesses an incredibly long and fascinating past, the argument of its unique, continuous antiquity, especially when compared to Europe, merits closer examination. It guides us away from monolithic interpretations, allowing for the ebb and flow, the rises and falls that are characteristic of all great human histories. What then becomes of this 5,000-year narrative? You might be wondering, why does it persist so strongly? Well, such historical narratives, however embellished, often serve a purpose beyond mere factual recall. They can become bedrock for national identity, a source of collective pride, and at times a tool in the intricate dance of international relations. This isn't unique to any single culture, of course. All nations, in some measure, craft and cherish the stories of their origins. Legacies and dust. From the quiet dissolution of civilizations, we turn now to the whispers of their beginnings. How indeed do complex societies, how do these grand civilizations truly emerge from the primordial mists of time? For a very long time, for centuries even, thinkers pondered this question, often framing it through their own cultural lens. Early ideas, you see, suggested a rather neat linear progression from a so-called savage state through barbarism and finally to civilization. But with the wisdom of hindsight and the tireless work of archaeologists and anthropologists, we began to understand that such notions were far too simplistic and often rather ethnocentric. Instead, we now speak of complexity. Think of it as a delicate tapestry woven with many threads, each thread representing a different aspect of human endeavor. A society becomes complex not merely by being large, but by integrating many diverse parts into a coherent whole. Imagine a sprawling city, a place where not everyone is tending fields, but where some fashion tools, others organize trade, and still others craft narratives of the cosmos. This intricate dance of specialization and interdependence, this is the hallmark of complexity. What are these threads, these correlations that speak to a complex society? Well, one of the most visible, of course, is the city itself, a dense aggregation of people living together. And with cities often comes the need for a surplus of food, an excess beyond what a family needs to merely subsist. This surplus, in turn, usually requires an intensification of agriculture, perhaps more sophisticated irrigation, or the cultivation of more resilient crops. All of this allows for specialization, where not everyone must farm, creating artisans, scholars, and administrators. Then almost inevitably, we observe a growing inequality within these societies, reflecting differences in access to resources and power. And finally, there are those multifunctional political and economic systems that bind it all together, systems that manage the flow of goods, arbitrate disputes, and perhaps even send armies into the field. Now, it's important to remember, not every complex society possesses all these traits, and certainly not to the same degree. But the more of these attributes we observe, and the more deeply they are integrated, the more complex, the more civilized, we might say, the society becomes. Whispers through ages. Indeed, as we journey through the echoes of the past, we often encounter narratives that, while captivating, may not always align perfectly with the dust-laden records we unearth. You see, history, much like memory, can be shaped and reshaped over time, sometimes with profound intent. Consider, if you will, the widely propagated idea of certain civilizations boasting 5 millennia of continuous history. Perhaps the most prominent example that comes to mind is the notion of 5,000 years of Chinese history. It's a phrase often uttered with conviction, presenting a picture of unparalleled ancient lineage. But here, the threads of our grand tapestry require a closer examination. The earliest documented archaeological and written evidence for what we now understand as Chinese civilization generally traces back to the Shang dynasty. This period, based on our current understanding, began around 1600 BCE. Even if we generously include the more mythical Xia dynasty, which itself is still debated among scholars, we're looking at a timeframe closer to 2000 BCE. This, while ancient, falls short of 5,000 years, doesn't it? What's interesting here is not to diminish the rich and complex history of that region, far from it. It's truly vast and fascinating, but rather to understand how such numerical narratives come to be. Other civilizations, for instance in Mesopotamia, can trace their urban roots back 7 millennia, with intricate writing systems flourishing long before. The ancient Egyptians, too, possessed sophisticated systems much older. What this tells us is that antiquity in itself is not a unique claim, but a shared inheritance of humanity. The unification of China as a singular political entity under the first emperor occurred in 221 BCE. This was a century after Alexander the Great's sprawling empire, and several centuries before the Roman Empire reached its zenith. Again, this perspective isn't meant to draw comparisons of superiority, but to provide a more nuanced timeline against other notable civilizations of the ancient world. It reminds us that claims of exceptionalism, when viewed through the lens of history, often reveal a shared human story, one filled with parallel developments and differing speeds. Now you might be wondering, why does this particular discrepancy matter? Why quibble over a few thousand years? Well, sometimes these grand historical narratives are employed for ends beyond mere academic discourse. The idea of an exceptionally long and continuous history has on occasion been used to suggest that a particular civilization requires special treatment, perhaps a greater degree of patience when awaiting democratic reforms, or a different approach in business dealings. It implies a kind of inherent wisdom, a deeper understanding of the world, born from sheer longevity. Imagine, for example, the discussions around companies operating within such frameworks. There are instances, such as with Google in 2007, where concessions were made regarding internet censorship, justified by some as a need for patience due to this perceived ancient rhythm of change within the country. The consequences of such concessions, leading to the censorship of sensitive topics like Tibet or the Tank Man image from Tiananmen Square, eventually culminated in Google's withdrawal from the market after cyberattacks targeting dissident accounts in 2009. It's a compelling reminder that the stories we tell about the past can deeply influence the present, affecting even the most practical and ethical decisions in commerce and global relations. Sweet dreams, seeker. Understanding these intricate patterns in ancient societies, you see, helps us to better comprehend the ebb and flow of human endeavor across the millennia. We've journeyed through the whispers of ages, from the first tentative steps towards agriculture to the grand, if sometimes tragic, collapses of once mighty civilizations. It is a long, winding river, this history of ours, and each bend reveals a new insight. We explored the very definition of complexity, moving past older, perhaps more ethnocentric ideas to embrace a nuanced view, one that considers both the diversity and the integration of many parts within a greater system. Cities, surplus food, specialized crafts, the delicate dance of inequality, all these, in their varying degrees and forms, painted the portrait of a complex society. And how did we arrive at such complexities? We considered the role of agriculture, that quiet revolution born of a stable climate, giving rise to settled life, monumental architecture, and, alas, often increased conflict. From Child's oasis hypothesis to Carnero's circumscription theory, we saw how scholars have grappled with the profound question of how and why we moved from scattered bands to organized states. No single answer, perchance, perfectly fits every civilization, but each theory, like a facet of a gemstone, reflects a sliver of the truth. Then we delved into the world of the classic Maya, a civilization whose pyramids pierced the jungle canopy, whose calendars charted the cosmos, and whose art sang of gods and kings. We saw how their worldview, deeply interwoven with creation myths and the sacred connection to ancestors, shaped their very existence. The Kayuhal Ajo, divine kings who bled for their people, and the intricate dance of reciprocity between the human and the divine, it all speaks to a profound understanding of their place in the universe. But even the most magnificent structures can crumble, and here we pondered the reasons for the Maya's decline. Not a single dramatic cataclysm, you see, but a confluence of factors: the subtle pressures of a growing population, the strain on resources, the bitter rivalry among ruling houses, and the relentless grip of drought. It serves as a gentle reminder that even the most sophisticated systems are ultimately fragile, bound by the delicate balance of their internal workings and their environment. Yet it wasn't an end to the Maya themselves, but rather a transformation, a poignant testament to human resilience and adaptation. Indeed, this expansive journey through 5 millennia has, I hope, offered you unique solace. It has been a quiet exploration, a gentle turning of the pages of time. For in these vast archives of the past, we find not only the stories of triumphs and tribulations, but also the enduring patterns that echo into our own present. Things change, certainly, but the fundamental currents of human nature and societal evolution, they remain, flowing ever onward. As we close this chapter, and indeed this entire series, I wish to express my gratitude for your companionship on this reflective journey. Thank you for listening, for allowing these stories to settle within you, aiding you, perchance, in finding that tranquil drift towards sleep. If these quiet lessons have brought you peace, I would be most appreciative if you considered subscribing to the channel and perhaps leaving a gentle thumbs up. There are other tales, other histories, awaiting discovery within these archives. May your dreams be as rich and profound as the history we have explored. Sweet dreams.